So my presentation is on The Right to Look by Nicholas Mirzoeff. He starts off his chapter by discussing the right to look, which is also a right to the real. He says it's not merely about seeing, and it begins at a personal level with the look into someone else's eyes to express friendship, solidarity, or love, and that look must be mutual. He discusses how having the right to look represents autonomy, which is being free to look, and the right to look opposes authority figures such as police who tell you to move on, there's nothing to see here, even though we both know that's a lie because there is something to see. And the opposite of the right to look is not censorship, he says, but visuality, which is the authority that tells us to move on. So visuality, he says, is an old word for an old project. It's not a trendy theory word meaning the totality of all visual images and devices, but instead it's an early 19th century term meaning the visualization of history. So the practice of visuality, he says, is imaginary instead of perceptual, and this is because what is being visualized is too large for any individual person to physically see or conceptualize, and visuality is not composed of only visual images, but instead combines information, ideas, imagination, and insight into a rendering of physical space. And the ability to create a visualization manifests authority and power of the visualizer, but this authority contrasts the authority of the right to look. So for some history of visuality, the first examples of visuality were found in slave plantations with monitored surveillance by the overseer. And then he says later in the 18th century, as battlefields became too large for generals to see physically, they began to visualize them instead. And the term visuality was first coined by Thomas Carlyle in 1840 to refer to what he called the tradition of heroic leadership, which visualizes history to sustain autocratic authority. And in other words, visualizing is the production of visuality, which also means making the processes of history perceptible to authority. So visuality in the hero, he says that visuality is a masculine trait and an attribute of the hero who could see history and envision the entire battlefield extending beyond any person's sight. Visuality was therefore a technique for the individual dominance of the ruler and the institution of sovereignty, and missionaries would visualize themselves as heroic subjects, and 20th century European fascist leaders were inspired by this concept as well. Today, counterinsurgency doctrine, which is an operation involving actions taken by the recognized government of a nation to stop an insurgency, indirectly relies on strategies of local and remote visualization. Visuality presented authority as self-evident, that division of the sensible whereby domination imposes the sensible evidence of its legitimacy. And this contrasts the right to look, which belongs in the categories of feminine, lesbian, queer, or transgender. And next he talks about his complexes of visuality, and the word complex in this context means the production of a set of social organizations and processes that form a given complex, such as the plantation complex, and the state of an individual's psychic economy, such as the Oedipus complex. And the complexes of visuality are a result of classifying, separating, and aestheticizing. And through these techniques, power is made to seem self-evident, and Mirzoeff discusses that classifying is a process of naming, categorizing, mapping, and identifying. Next, visuality separates those classified groups as a means of social organization. This is so these groups, such as workers, do not unite and revolt. And lastly, visualization makes this separated classification seem right and aesthetic. So this means that people with power can always justify why they have power and always explain why what they're doing is right. So his three visuality complexes. The first one is the plantation complex from 1660 to 1865, which sustained the transatlantic slave trade. The next is the imperial complex from 1857 to 1947, and this term was used by apologists for the British Empire. And then the next one is the military complex, which is from 1945 to today, and this term was used by President Dwight Eisenhower in his exit speech. And these complexes have been opposed by the enslaved for the plantation complex, the colonized for the imperial complex, and the opponents of war for the military complex, All of these groups asserted autonomy from authority by claiming their right to look. So for the plantation complex, this was formed by various classification moves in the mid-17th century, such as the establishment of the Barbados Slave Code in 1661, the required mapping of all slave plantations in 1670, and the creation of the Discourse of Natural History in 1657. And the slave was classified by law because of this and natural history, and he was confined to the plantation where he or she was under the surveillance of the overseer. So the plantation complex continued. This complex was a way of recording the post-colonial reality through management techniques of visualized surveillance. When you blind someone, you make them a slave and remove their ability to become free and autonomous. And while transatlantic slave traders did not physically blind their slaves because they knew that the physical labor they were required to do, they needed to be able to see, instead they policed the slave's imagination. An example of this is in Jamaica, the British colony. Slaves were forbidden to imagine the death of a white person, and this puts the white people in the plantations in a place of power and makes them equivalent to the sovereign of a home nation. Another example is after the Haitian Revolution and the dramas of abolition. A person of color was forbidden to look at a white woman or a white figure of authority, and therefore slavery monitors and removes the right to look. The legacy of the plantation complex is the local surveillance of people by one authority figure, and this formal practice of visualized surveillance used in plantation complex is similar to physical binding. So then Mirzoeff discusses countervisuality. It's not just a different way of seeing or a different way of looking at images, but the tactics to dismantle the visual strategies of the hegemonic system. It is, in other words, the attempt to reconfigure visuality as a whole, and thus the right to look, which goes even further than just the right to look back, although looking back is a first step towards countervisuality. And the realism of countervisuality is the means by which one tries to make sense of the unreality created by visuality's authority, while at the same time proposing a real alternative. And it is by no means a simpler mimetic depiction of lived experience, but one that depicts existing realities and counters them with a different realism. So the next complex is the imperial complex, and the imperial visuality was a centralized model for the control of remote populations. It worked as a new system of governments of the overseas empire, mainly through the action of great men such as the missionaries and heroes we discussed earlier. And this imperial complex of visuality linked centralized authority to a hierarchy of civilization in which the culture dominated the primitive. And during this, the nations became conceptualized as hierarchies of culture. So the imperial complex continued. Charles Darwin's philosophies describe the evolution of humanity as existing in real time, with the primitive being separated only by space from the civilized. And Mirzoeff says that the civilized could visualize while the primitive people could not. So on to his third complex, which is the military-industrial complex. It's a concept commonly used to refer to policy and monetary relationships between legislators, national armed forces, and the defense industrial base that supports them. Another definition is a phrase used to signify a comfortable relationship between parties that are charged to manage wars, such as the military, the presidential administration, and Congress, and companies that produce weapons and equipment for the war, such as the industries. And this complex is an all too friendly relationship that may develop between defense contractors and government forces, where both sides receive what they are perceivably looking for, which is a successful military engagement for war planners and financial profit for those manning the corporate boardrooms. And this complex can be viewed as a war for profit theory. And Dwight Eisenhower warned us about allowing the military-industrial complex to grow beyond all reasonable dimensions and influence in our government, economy, and society. And today many people say the military-industrial complex is out of control. So I have a quick video for you about it.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So the military-industrial complex continued. I found this from an outside source, but I thought it was relevant. It says, "The truth is that the war on terror is a simulation of a war. Terror is an abstraction, not a real, identifiable enemy. It's a matter of opinion whether someone is a terrorist or a freedom fighter. The purpose of this strange, obscure, unidentified war is to keep the military-industrial complex and intelligence agencies in a position of permanent power to justify governments taking severe measures against their people in the name of homeland security. Everyone is spied on by the authorities." In Orwell's prophetic novel, 1984, war was permanent, the perfect means to control the population. If there are no real wars, then the old world order will simply stimulate them, just as Big Brother did in 1984. No one can tell the difference anymore. And Mirsov says that visuality is a technique for waging war appropriated as a means to justify authority as the imagining of history. And some more. Mirsov says this complex is reinterpreted in terms of panoptic visuality, and these imaginary images only intend to control rather than reform by separating the host population from the insurgent, as if quarantining the former from infection by the latter, nor is the violence intended, as on the plantation, to sustain production. And the military-industrial complex and the commander's visualization forms are the basis for conducting operations. And the visualized information of war is now a means to map chaos, locate places for separation, and target those to be killed. So in conclusion, for Mirsov, visuality is not a part of the everyday, but it is the everyday. His theories are central to the study of visual culture, which recognizes the predominance of visual forms of media, communication, and information in the postmodern world. And visual studies is often understood as a tactic for studying the functions of a world addressed through pictures, images, visualizations, rather than through text and words. However, most of our experience of media is a hybrid of text, images, and sounds rather than pure states of any one mode. The visual is always contaminated by the non-visual, such as ideologies, texts, discourses, beliefs, intertextual presuppositions, prior experience, and visual competence. That's it. Thank you.